Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was a quiet evening, the kind that feels almost too still, where everything seems to be holding its breath in anticipation. I had just finished a long day, sitting on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading, my mind too tired to focus on anything but the quiet hum of the apartment around me. The rain had been falling steadily all day, tapping against the windows with its soft rhythm, soothing in its own way. It was a peaceful moment, and for a brief time, I thought I could just let the world outside fade away. But then I noticed something. At first, it was subtle. Something so small I could have easily dismissed it. A flicker of light outside the window. Not the usual glow of the street lamps, or the soft shimmer of headlights passing through the rain. But something different. It made me pause, a ripple in the otherwise calm evening. I looked up from my book, and without thinking, I stood up and walked over to the window. I wasn't expecting much, just the typical city view. My apartment was on the 5th floor of a building that overlooked a busy street. And beyond that, the skyline stretched toward the horizon. The sky was overcast, as it had been all day, but there was a dim, comforting light to it. I leaned against the cool glass, peering out, expecting to see the usual smattering of clouds, the dimming light of dusk, and the silhouette of buildings against the sky. But there was nothing. The sky wasn't there, it was gone. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the rain, or the way the light hit the glass. But no, there was no sky. Just a deep, empty void where the sky should have been. The view outside, which had always been a mix of streetlights, buildings, and a vast expanse of sky above it, was now reduced to a void. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. The rain, the streets, the cars passing by, they were still there, normal as ever. But above them, where the sky should have been, was an unbroken expanse of blackness. No clouds, no fading light from the sunset, no stars, just a smooth, endless darkness. I pressed my hand against the glass, half expecting to feel a shift in the air or the cool breeze that usually came through the window, but it was still. The silence was what struck me next. It was as if the world outside had quieted, as though the rain had stopped, even though I could still hear the soft patter against the window, the city noises, the distant hum of traffic. The occasional footsteps on the sidewalk were all muffled, as if they were coming from a far distance, or perhaps from somewhere else altogether. I took a step back, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. I'd lived here for years, and I knew what the sky looked like. It had always been there, always a presence, always part of the world outside my window. But now there was nothing. The emptiness felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. It had to be some kind of illusion, right? A trick of the light, or maybe something to do with the storm outside. But when I looked again, the sky was still gone. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the empty space, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. My breath fogged up the glass in front of me, and I wiped it away, absent-mindedly, almost as if I expected the glass to reveal something new. But nothing changed. Finally, I turned away from the window, my head spinning. I felt lightheaded, almost as if I were no longer in the same place. The apartment felt distant, as though the walls were slowly shifting, moving away from me. I walked back toward the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the air around me had changed, that the absence of the sky had left something behind. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly, and tried to focus on the room around me. The dim light from the lamps seemed too harsh now, too bright in comparison to the unsettling emptiness outside. I glanced back toward the window, expecting to see the familiar view, but the darkness was still there, unbroken. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just a trick of the mind, something I had imagined in the quiet of the evening, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. There was no logical explanation. The sky was simply gone, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't supposed to see, that there was something fundamentally wrong about it, something I wasn't supposed to understand. As the evening dragged on, I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, scrolling through my phone, but it was all pointless. Every time I looked out that window, I was drawn back into the vast, endless darkness. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, filling the space of my apartment, suffocating me with its quiet presence. Later, I finally managed to get some sleep, but it wasn't restful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the void, the endless blackness where the sky had been. It haunted me, creeping into my dreams, until I woke up in a cold sweat. The feeling of the missing sky lingering in the back of my mind. The next morning, I hesitated before I went to the window again. When I finally did, I was half expecting to see the same void, the same absence of the sky. But when I looked outside, everything was normal. The sky was back, blue and open, the clouds lazily drifting by. I almost laughed with relief, the weight lifting off my chest, as though the world had returned to its rightful place. But something inside me didn't feel quite the same. The emptiness that had settled in my chest was still there, lingering in the quiet moments of the day. I had expected it to be a dream, a hallucination, or some strange side effect of the storm, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. The sky hadn't just disappeared. It had been taken, and whatever force had stolen it from me had left something behind, a shadow, a sense of wrongness that clung to me, as if the world itself had cracked open and something had slipped through. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the sky might be gone again one day. That, in a moment I couldn't predict, it would vanish again and I wouldn't be able to find it. I've always had a strange relationship with trains. I don't know why, but there's something about them, something about the rhythmic clatter of the tracks, the smell of the old metal, the low hum of the engine that feels both comforting and unsettling at the same time. It's almost as if every journey is a small promise of escape, a chance to leave one place behind and start fresh somewhere else. It was a crisp morning, the kind of morning where the air feels sharp against your skin, and the sky is just barely beginning to lighten. I was running late, as usual. I had just enough time to catch my regular train, the one that would take me from the outskirts of the city into the heart of town. The train station was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. There was the usual mix of commuters, a few hurried faces, a couple of people with their noses buried in newspapers. and the low murmur of people talking to themselves or to others on their phones. I wasn't paying much attention to any of it. My mind focused solely on catching that train and getting to work. The platform was a little more crowded than usual, but I didn't think much of it. I had been on this train 100 times. I knew it well, every creak and shudder, every stop and start. I knew the rhythm of the city's pulse, and I had fallen into it without thinking. The train arrived, the doors opening with their usual hiss of air, and I stepped forward, weaving through the crowd. I had a habit of getting on as quickly as possible, not wanting to waste time waiting for the doors to close behind me. There's something about getting on a train that makes you feel like you've accomplished something, like you're part of some bigger machine, moving forward in time. I was close to the door when it started to close. I stepped forward, just in time to slip through. But instead of stepping onto the familiar floor of the train, I found myself standing on the platform, the doors sliding shut in front of me. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The sound of the train, the murmur of the crowd, it all faded away. I stood there, staring at the doors, utterly confused. I hadn't missed it. I hadn't hesitated. I was sure of it. I had been right there, almost inside, when the doors closed. But now, they were locked tight, and the train was moving, starting to pull away from the platform. I stepped back, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had felt the cool rush of the train doors as they closed. I had heard the usual sound, the metallic clank of the door shutting, the small jolt as the train prepared to leave, but I wasn't inside. I was standing on the platform, and the train was moving away without me. I stared after it, the train pulling slowly into the distance, its lights blinking in the early morning gloom. My heart began to race, an uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. I looked around quickly to make sure no one else had noticed, but the people around me were absorbed in their own worlds. The world felt oddly quiet, the usual hum of the station muted, as if the whole scene had been frozen in time. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of confusion wouldn't leave. There were still a few people waiting for the next train, and I wasn't the only one who had missed this one. But something felt wrong. The train should have been right there. The doors should have opened. I should have been inside. But I wasn't. I decided to wait for the next train. I tried to calm my mind, telling myself it was just an accident. Maybe I had been too late. Or maybe the doors had closed too quickly. But as I stood there, watching the second train approach, I couldn't shake the thought that something had shifted. It wasn't just that I had missed it. It was the certainty that I had been almost asterisk inside. I had felt it, the cool metal of the train doors, the vibration beneath my feet, but somehow, I hadn't made it. The second train arrived, and I climbed aboard, feeling the familiar sensation of the car rocking gently beneath me. I found a seat by the window and sat down, still a little shaken by the strange experience. The train moved smoothly forward, and I looked out at the passing city, trying to focus on something, anything, to ground me. The station I had just left was a blur now, fading away in the distance, but I couldn't get rid of the image of the train doors closing in front of me. It felt as though time had slipped somehow, as if I had been left behind on the wrong side of it. And then, something else happened. As the train rolled through the city, I saw something in the reflection of the window. At first, it was just a blur flash of movement, but as the train picked up speed, the reflection grew clearer. In the window, I saw the same train, the one I had just missed, pulling into another station. But it wasn't just the train. It was me, standing by the door, just as I had been before. The doors were closing, just like before, and I could see myself, standing there, waiting to get on. But I was already on this train. I had gotten on, hadn't I? I was sitting here, watching the city pass by outside. I wasn't standing there, waiting for the door to close again. But the reflection, it didn't lie. There I was, waiting. The doors closed, the train pulled away, and the reflection vanished. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to look again, but the reflection was gone. The train outside the window had disappeared into the distance, leaving only the blurred outline of the city behind. I leaned back in my seat, suddenly feeling very small, very far from where I had thought I was. My mind raced. What had just happened? What had I seen? I had been on that platform. I had stepped forward. But somehow, I had ended up on the train. Had it all been a mistake? Was I losing track of time, or was something more strange happening here? The rest of the ride felt long, the minutes stretching out as I sat there, trying to calm my racing thoughts. By the time I reached my stop, I had convinced myself that it had just been a trick of the mind. A moment of confusion. But as I stepped off the train, I looked back one last time at the tracks, the platform now bathed in the soft light of morning. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the station, someone waiting for the train. The doors were closed, and I was sure I saw myself standing there, waiting to board. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. It began on an ordinary afternoon, one of those gray, overcast days that hangs in the air, quiet and heavy. I was walking down the street, heading home after a long day of errands, when I noticed something strange. I wasn't sure why it caught my attention at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the footsteps. They were faint at first, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable in their rhythm. Soft, quick steps that seemed to echo from the pavement ahead of me. I glanced around, but the street was almost empty. There were no other pedestrians in sight, no cars passing by. I was alone in the middle of a quiet residential area. The kind of place where the only sound you typically hear is the wind rustling through the trees. But these footsteps, no one else was around. I slowed my pace, trying to figure out where they were coming from. I looked down at the pavement, half expecting to see something on the ground, but there was nothing. The footsteps kept coming, just ahead of me. The sound of shoes hitting the ground, quick and deliberate, but not heavy just enough to make me wonder. Who else could be out here? Why was I hearing them, but not seeing anyone? Curiosity piqued. I started walking a little faster, not quite running, but moving quickly enough to catch up. It felt strange, almost like I was being drawn forward. The footsteps were always just ahead of me, like someone was just out of view, walking at the same pace, keeping a steady distance. But no matter how much I hurried, I never caught sight of them. The air felt heavier now, like the sky itself was waiting for something to happen. I rounded a corner, still following the sound of the steps, my heart quickening as I wondered why I couldn't see the person responsible for them. My feet carried me instinctively, the echo of the footsteps matching my own stride now, and yet I hadn't seen anyone. I started to feel a strange tension building in my chest, as though I was being pulled deeper into something that didn't quite make sense. I passed a few more houses, the quietness almost suffocating now. The street was lined with trees, their bare branches reaching out like fingers against the gray sky, and the houses were dark, their windows closed tight. No lights, no movement. It was as if time had slowed to a crawl, or maybe even stopped altogether. And then, as I rounded another corner, I saw it. The footsteps had led me to a narrow alley tucked between two old, crumbling houses. The walls were covered in ivy, their surfaces dark with years of neglect. The alley was shadowed, barely lit by the faint light filtering through the overcast sky. The footsteps stopped right at the entrance, the sound of shoes against pavement suddenly gone. There was no one there. I stopped, standing at the mouth of the alley, my breath shallow and quick. I looked down the narrow path, the shadows creeping in on both sides, hiding whatever lay ahead. The silence was deafening. I glanced behind me, but the street was empty now. The footsteps were gone. I should have turned around then. My rational mind screamed at me to go back, to forget what I had heard, what I had followed. But something kept me rooted to the spot, some strange pull that kept me from walking away. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I had to know, had to see where those footsteps had gone, even though I knew it didn't make sense. I stepped forward, my shoes tapping softly on the wet ground as I moved into the alley. The walls on either side of me seemed to close in as I walked, and the shadows stretched longer, darker, as though the alley itself was swallowing the light. I walked slowly, cautiously, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. The air was thick, heavy with a smell I couldn't place, musty, damp, like something had been left forgotten for far too long. The alley twisted and turned, each bend leading to another dead end, another turn that brought me deeper into its clutches. I couldn't tell how far I had gone. The quiet, oppressive stillness was broken only by the soft scrape of my feet against the gravel, the occasional creak of the wooden fences lining the alley. I turned yet another corner and found myself at another dead end. The alley had stopped, the walls ending abruptly in a high, unmarked brick wall. There was nowhere else to go. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wall, the silence around me suffocating. The footsteps had stopped long ago, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the path I had been following was never meant to lead me anywhere at all. I turned back, my eyes scanning the narrow alley behind me. The streetlights were barely visible from where I stood, and the world outside seemed so far away, as though I had stepped into another reality altogether. I took a few hesitant steps back, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. How had I gotten here? What had I been following? As I turned around to retrace my steps, I heard something, a soft sound, like a breath. I froze, my heart pounding. But when I looked around, there was nothing. The alley was empty, the air heavy with an unshakable stillness. No footsteps. No sounds. No one? I turned and ran then, my footsteps echoing against the alley walls, the sound of my own breath louder than anything else. I didn't look back, but I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in behind me. The sensation of being watched, followed, waiting for something I couldn't see. When I finally emerged from the alley and stepped back onto the street, I paused, taking in the quiet around me. The normal sounds of the city were gone now, replaced by an unsettling silence. The street was empty, no one was there. It felt like the city had changed somehow, like I had stepped out of time, out of reality itself. The alley had disappeared. There was no alley where it had been. No narrow path, no twisting walls. Just an empty stretch of sidewalk where nothing unusual had ever been. No footsteps to follow. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just followed someone's footsteps. I had followed something else. Something that had never meant for me to find my way back. It was one of those evenings where the air feels just a little too still. The kind of quiet that fills you with a sense of restlessness. I had been walking down the familiar street that led home from the coffee shop, the one I took almost every day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a cool, muted sky, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The world around me was gradually settling into twilight, a time when everything feels both intimate and distant at the same time. I had my head down, lost in thought, when I noticed her. She was walking in the opposite direction, just a few feet ahead of me, moving with a quiet grace that caught my attention. It wasn't that she stood out, not really. She was just another person on the street, dressed in a light jacket and jeans, with dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. But there was something about the way she moved, something that made me glance up from my phone and take note of her. As she passed me, I couldn't help but feel that strange, inexplicable tug-a sensation that I had seen her before, but couldn't place where or when. Maybe it was just the way she carried herself, her calm demeanor, the way her eyes didn't seem to notice the world around her. She didn't glance at me, didn't even look up from the pavement ahead of her. She just walked by, the soft sound of her footsteps blending into the ambient noises of the city. But that's when it happened. As she walked past, I saw something in the store window to my left. The glass reflected her figure, but it wasn't just her silhouette. There, in the reflection, she was still walking, as expected. But something about it felt off. The image in the glass wasn't. Just a reflection of hurt was something else entirely. Her face, which had seemed so indifferent in real life, was now looking straight at me, her eyes locking with mine through the reflection, even though she hadn't once turned her head. I froze for a second, my heart skipping a beat. I was sure that I hadn't seen her face before. I was sure that she hadn't looked at me as she passed. But the reflection was different. Her expression in the glass was calm, almost serene, yet it carried an intensity that the real version of her didn't possess. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like I was intruding, but the reflection didn't move. It was like she was standing still in the window, her eyes still on me, not blinking, not shifting. I blinked a few times, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or the angle of the window, or something equally mundane. But when I looked again, the reflection of her was still there, perfectly still, like she had been paused in time. I looked around. The street was still busy, people moving past me, cars driving by. No one seemed to notice the oddness of it, as though the world was continuing on, oblivious to the strange stillness in the window. My feet were planted in place, my body frozen between two moments, the real world where she had just passed by me, and the strange world reflected back at me, where she was standing still, looking at me. I wanted to turn away, to walk past, and forget about it. But I couldn't. My gaze was locked on the reflection, and as I watched, her expression slowly shifted. Her eyes, still unblinking, still fixed on mine, seemed to soften. And then, ever so faintly, the corners of her lips curled upward in a smile. It was a subtle thing, just the barest hint of a grin, but it felt like it was meant for me. A smile that seemed to say, asterisk, you know me, don't you? Asterisk. I stumbled backward, my heart thudding in my chest, my legs unsteady beneath me. But as I took another step back, I saw something else. The reflection of her, which had been frozen in place, slowly began to move again, just like her real self. She continued walking down the street, moving away from me. But the reflection stayed behind. The woman in the window was no longer walking forward, no longer a mirror image of the real world. Instead, her reflection lingered, watching me as I backed away, her eyes never leaving mine. My feet finally regained control, and I turned away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. The cold air of the evening hit me as I walked briskly down the street, my footsteps quickening as I glanced back over my shoulder. But the reflection and the woman who had passed me by were gone. The window was now just a blank, lifeless reflection of the street, showing only the muted glow of the streetlights. I tried to shake it off. I had to. It didn't make sense. There was no way the reflection could have stayed behind like that. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or perhaps the lighting in the window had created an illusion. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't escape the feeling that something had happened. Something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. As I made my way home that night, I kept thinking about the smile, that eerie, knowing smile that had appeared on her face just before she disappeared. I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't passed me on the street at all, that she had been waiting for me, somehow watching me, and that the reflection was not just a reflection, but a presence, an echo of something more. The next day, I found myself walking down the same street again. The sun was out, the streets bustling with life. I told myself it was a silly thing, an odd moment I had imagined. But as I passed the same store, I couldn't help but glance at the window. The reflection inside was normal, just the usual view of the street. But for a brief moment, as I walked past, I could have sworn I saw her again, standing still in the reflection, watching me. And this time, she smiled. It was late, later than I'd expected it to be. The city was quiet, the streets slick from an earlier downpour, and the usual hustle of the day had given way to a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. I had been at a friend's party, The kind where the evening drags on longer than you'd planned, and suddenly you're standing outside in the cool night air, wondering how the hours slipped away so quickly. The party was winding down, and I knew I had to leave. My phone had died earlier, and I didn't want to wait around for another rideshare app to match me with a driver. So I opted for the classic, a taxi. It took a few minutes, but eventually, I saw the familiar yellow shape of a cab pull up to the curb. The light on top blinked, and I hurried toward it, eager to get home. The air had a sharp chill to it, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter around you, and the streets were nearly deserted now, save for the occasional car passing in the distance. The door to the taxi opened before I had a chance to reach for it, and I slid into the back seat without a word. The driver, an older man with gray hair and a weathered face, didn't say anything either. He just looked at me briefly in the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting mine, and then focused back on the road ahead. I didn't mind the silence. Sometimes, after a long night, silence feels like a comfort. The city's hum outside was enough to fill the space between us. I didn't ask for directions, he knew where I was going. I had ridden in taxis like this before, and the route was second nature to him. The engine hummed steadily beneath me, the streetlights outside flashing by in rhythmic intervals, casting shadows across the back seat. I could feel the weight of the evening finally settling on me, the warmth of the taxi cabin lulling me into a tired daze. My mind began to wander, replaying bits and pieces of the party I'd just left, the conversations I'd had, the people I'd met. But there was something strange about the air in the cab. It felt too still, almost suffocating. The driver hadn't spoken a word, and I found that odd. It wasn't that I needed him to talk again. Sometimes the silence is the best part, but there was something unsettling about how the air in the car felt too thick. Like the absence of conversation was stretching it taut. The streetlights outside began to flicker in a strange pattern, casting fleeting distorted shadows across the cab's interior. I glanced over at the driver's face again, but his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, never meeting mine, his expression unreadable. I tried to shake the strange feeling that was creeping up my spine. He had a calm demeanor to calm, but there was something in his silence that felt wrong. I looked at the back of the driver's head, the way his graying hair was cut short, the faint glint of his glasses reflected in the dim light. I had been sitting in the back seat for what felt like a while now, and I realized I hadn't heard him breathe. I hadn't heard him make a single sound since I got in. I couldn't explain it, but I had this strange, unsettling sense that he wasn't entirely there. I shifted in my seat, the leather creaking beneath me, trying to shrug off the feeling that something wasn't right. The streets outside grew darker as we drove through neighborhoods I didn't recognize. We were moving further from the city center, away from the well-lit streets that led toward the familiarity of home. I glanced at the meter. The fare had climbed higher than I expected, and we weren't close to my apartment yet. I tried to focus on the road outside, hoping to see a landmark or something familiar. But it was like the city was shifting before my eyes. The streets, once so familiar, had become winding and unfamiliar. I could feel my chest tightening, the familiar sense of unease creeping back in. I looked up at the rearview mirror again, expecting to catch the driver's gaze, to say something, anything, but he didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his expression entirely neutral, almost as if he were in a trance. It felt wrong. I had never had a taxi driver so quiet, so distant. My throat went dry, and I felt my pulse quicken. The streets outside seemed to blur, the lights outside becoming more distant and dim, like they were slipping away from me. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and I swallowed hard. I had to speak. I had to do something. I opened my mouth to ask the driver something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though my voice was caught somewhere in my chest, tangled up in my nerves. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I looked back at the driver, studying him carefully. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the skin of his knuckles pale under the faint streetlight. The car jolted slightly as it hit a pothole, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw his fingers twitch, as though he was about to turn the wheel in another direction, but he didn't. He didn't flinch, didn't move. It was as though he was a statue, frozen in place, locked into his driving like a machine. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to breathe deeply, to calm myself, but the air inside the car was growing stifling. I could hear the soft whir of the engine, the tires on the wet road, but that was all. No sound from the driver, no traffic noises from outside, just the slow, steady hum of the car as it carried me further into an unfamiliar part of the city. The meter clicked again, but I didn't dare look at it. I didn't know how much time had passed, or how far we had traveled, but it felt like an eternity. The dread continued to build inside me, gnawing at my insides. My palms were sweating, my heartbeat quickening with every moment that ticked by in this heavy, oppressive silence. I finally turned my gaze back to the front of the taxi, and that's when I saw it. The street ahead of us wasn't just unfamiliar. It didn't look like a street at all. The road had transformed, the lights growing dimmer and dimmer as we moved further into the darkness. The buildings on either side of us were warped and twisted, their shapes bending in ways that didn't make sense. The world outside had become something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the city I knew. I had to get out. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with it. The moment I touched it, the car screeched to a halt, the sudden motion throwing me back against the seat. I looked at the driver, my breath caught in my throat, but his face remained expressionless, his hands still gripping the wheel, not a single sound coming from him. The car had stopped. We were no longer moving. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty road ahead. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. And then, the driver turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face in the mirror. But he never spoke. It started as a typical evening, a quiet night in the city that felt too familiar, like I had passed through it 1,000 times before. I had just finished work, the usual mix of exhaustion and relief settling in, and I was ready to make my way home. I'd walked this same path many times, down the same street, under the same streetlights, past the same shops with their glowing windows. The cool breeze brushed against my face, and the familiar hum of the city seemed to wrap around me like a soft blanket. The streetlights flickered as I walked, a brief stutter in their usual rhythm. I paused for a moment, glancing up, but nothing unusual happened. They flickered again, and I felt a slight unease settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't anything significant, just a glitch in the mundane, but it was enough to make me pause. I'd seen streetlights flicker before, especially on windy nights or when they were old, but tonight felt different somehow. I shrugged it off and kept walking, my mind distracted by the thoughts of home. The noise of the city began to fade as I walked further down the street. The busy sounds of traffic replaced by the quieter, more subdued rhythm of my footsteps. I crossed the street, and as I did, the flickering lights seemed to intensify, almost as if they were struggling to keep their light steady. I could feel the air shift, as though something was tugging at the edges of reality, but I didn't think much of it. I had places to be, thoughts to focus on, and I wasn't about to get caught up in something silly. But then, something happened. I turned a corner, expecting the usual view of the row of apartments, the occasional car passing by, but instead I found myself standing in front of a street I didn't recognize. The buildings were different. The architecture was old, but not in the comforting, historical sense, more in the way a forgotten place looks when it has been left behind. The street was narrower than the one I'd been walking on, the buildings towering over me in a way that made me feel small. The streetlights above flickered again, but this time they were casting long, strange shadows, twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. I paused for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. How had I gotten here? I looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that would tell me I had just wandered a few blocks too far, but there was nothing. There were no street signs, no recognizable landmarks, no familiar shops or restaurants. I couldn't recall seeing this part of the city before, even though I had lived here for years. My mind raced. Had I somehow taken a wrong turn? Was I lost? I retraced my steps, heading back the way I came, only to find that the street I had just walked down was gone. There was no corner, no familiar buildings, nothing. It was as if the street had disappeared, replaced by a different one entirely. I checked my phone, but the map showed no results, just a blank screen. I felt a knot form in my stomach as the realization hit me. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. The city around me seemed eerily silent. I couldn't hear the usual sounds, the distant hum of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the soft rush of people moving about. There was no one in sight. The street ahead stretched on in the same direction, and I reluctantly took a step forward, my legs feeling heavier with every movement. The air had a strange quality to it, as though the atmosphere itself was thickening, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I tried to shake the thought, but it clung to me like a shadow. The further I walked, the more unsettling the city became. The buildings grew taller, the street narrower. The streetlights flickered again, and with every flicker, the darkness seemed to deepen just a little bit more. As I moved further, the city began to distort. I noticed that the shop windows were dark, and the signs above the doors were faded, almost illegible. The buildings, which at first had seemed old, now appeared abandoned, as if no one had lived or worked here in decades. I walked faster now, my footsteps echoing louder in the stillness. Every corner I turned only led me deeper into this unfamiliar part of the city. The flickering lights above seemed to follow me, casting fleeting, unnatural shadows that darted in and out of view. The streets seemed to stretch on forever, and the further I walked, the more disoriented I became. I stopped suddenly, my heart racing. The street ahead had shifted, just like the one I had walked down before. It wasn't the same street anymore. The buildings had changed once again, becoming more decrepit, more distant from the world I knew. I glanced over my shoulder, only to find that the street I had just come from was gone too, replaced by something else entirely. A cold dread washed over me, and I could feel my breathing quicken. I was no longer in the city I had known. This place, this unfamiliar city, felt wrong. I couldn't tell if I had been walking for minutes or hours. Time seemed irrelevant here. It was as if I had stepped into a place outside of time, a city that existed in some kind of limbo between worlds. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but my mind was clouded, my thoughts fragmented. I looked up again at the flickering streetlights above me and realized something even more disturbing. The lights were no longer casting shadows at all. They were casting something else, something darker, something that didn't belong. I couldn't stay here. I turned and ran, hoping to find some way back to the world I knew. But no matter which direction I took, no matter how many turns I made, the city refused to change. The buildings stayed the same, the lights continued to flicker, and the emptiness followed me like a shadow. I don't know how long I ran. Time had stopped making sense. Eventually, I collapsed onto a bench in a small, empty park. I was out of breath, drenched in sweat, and my heart pounded in my chest. When I looked around again, the streetlights had stopped flickering. The city was quiet, still, and there, just ahead of me, I saw the familiar buildings of the city I had known my city. The streetlights were steady again, casting their soft glow on the road in front of me. The streets were bustling, the familiar sounds of traffic and voices filled the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I walked back home that night, the lights from the street casting a calm, reassuring glow. But when I looked back over my shoulder, just for a second, I thought I saw the flicker of the streetlights again, like a shadow, just beyond the corner. And I couldn't help but wonder, had I really come back? Or had I just wandered into a place I wasn't meant to leave? It was just another evening, the kind where the world outside my window had dimmed into a quiet night. The room was dimly lit, the soft amber light from the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. I sat in my chair by the window, wrapped in the comforting hum of the quiet apartment. The rain had started earlier, light at first, but now it tapped steadily against the window pane, providing a soothing backdrop for my thoughts. I had been reading for a while, lost in a book that was too captivating to put down. The world outside becoming more and more distant as I turned page after page. The gentle drip-drip of the rain combined with the soft flicker of the lamp to make everything feel peaceful. But as I settled deeper into the book, my mind wandered for just a moment, the silence around me making it easy to do. That's when I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker, something peripheral. I thought perhaps it was my eyes playing tricks on me. The room was dim, after all, and the rain had begun to pick up. creating strange movements of light as the water slid down the window. But then it happened again. The shadow stretched across the wall, elongated and thin, shifting as though it were being cast by some unseen figure. I froze. My eyes darted from the book in my hands to the shadow on the wall. There was no one there. No one in the room with me, no movement, no sound. Just the soft, rhythmic patter of rain outside. The shadow continued to move fluidly, crossing from one side of the wall to the other, as if something invisible was walking past me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a strange, unsettling chill creep up my spine. I tried to dismiss it as nothing, just a trick of the light, maybe. But the shadow moved again. It crept, slow and deliberate, across the room as though it had a purpose. I stood up, my feet suddenly heavy, the room feeling too small, too suffocating. The hairs on my arms stood on end, the warmth of the lamp feeling somehow distant, as though it were no longer enough to keep the cold from seeping in. I moved toward the wall, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was something outside a tree branch, a car's headlights, but none of it made sense. The shadow was too deliberate. It moved too smoothly. The light in the room hadn't changed. There was no source of the shadow but the one in my mind, and it wasn't right. It wasn't like a normal shadow at all. I stood still for a moment, watching it. The shadow stretched, paused for just a second, and then began to withdraw, like it was retreating into the dark corners of the room. My heart beat faster, each thump louder than the last. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to look away. I took a step forward, my footfall too loud in the stillness of the room. The shadow faltered for a split second, then resumed its slow crawl, its edges sharpening as it seemed to grow more defined. It didn't stop. It moved relentlessly across the wall, like a reflection of something I couldn't see, like it was searching for something. Or someone. My mouth went dry, and I found myself moving backward, instinctively, away from it. The air in the room seemed to thicken, like I was being smothered by an invisible force. My breath felt shallow, my hands cold and clammy against the sides of the chair as I clutched it for stability. But no matter how hard I tried to look away, my eyes remained locked on the shadow, tracing its every movement. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't the only one in the room anymore. A presence, something. I could feel it, though there was no sound, no footsteps, no breath. But the air was heavier now, thick with something unexplainable, as though the very space around me had changed. I snapped my head to the other side of the room, half expecting to see something standing there, something that had been lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing. The room was still empty. No one had entered. No one was there. The shadow, though it didn't stop. It kept moving, traveling along the farthest corner of the wall and disappearing behind a chair, as if it had reached the end of its journey. I waited in the silence that followed, my pulse loud in my ears, but it didn't come back. No more movement. No more flickers of shape across the wall. Just the steady sound of the rain tapping against the window. I sat down slowly, my body trembling from a mixture of adrenaline and fear. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. Maybe the lamp's bulb was flickering, or a gust of wind had caused the shadows to shift. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more I felt that something wasn't quite right. The feeling lingered in the air, heavy and thick, like the residue of something that had been there and now wasn't. I glanced at the clock. It had been 5 minutes. 5 minutes since I had seen the shadow, but it felt like hours. I stayed in the room for a while longer, not moving, just listening to the rain. My eyes kept darting to the walls, half expecting the shadow to appear again, but it never did. The room was still. The silence was deafening. And for the rest of that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The air still felt thick, with something I couldn't explain. Every time I walk into that room now, I glance at the wall where the shadow moved. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks, or if something was actually there, something that I couldn't fully understand. But it's there now, always lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow in the corner of my vision, just waiting to move again. It was one of those rare nights where the weather was perfect. Not too cold, not too warm. Just the kind of evening that invited you to step outside and enjoy a little solitude. I had been craving something different, a break from my usual routine, so I decided to visit the small restaurant I had passed by countless times but had never actually stepped into. The sign outside, a simple wooden board with the name The Old Lantern, had always intrigued me, and tonight seemed as good a time as any to try something new. I walked in, pushing open the door with a soft creak. The scent of fresh bread and something savory in the air immediately enveloping me. The restaurant had a cozy, almost nostalgic feel, dimly lit, with old wooden tables and chairs that looked well-worn, as though they'd witnessed countless stories, countless quiet dinners. The warm golden light from the hanging bulbs gave the whole place a soft glow, casting long shadows on the walls that made the space feel intimate and inviting. There were a few people scattered around, the sound of quiet conversation filling the air. The clink of glassware and the soft hum of background music added to the comforting atmosphere. I sat at a table by the window, the street outside bathed in the soft orange of the streetlights, rain gently tapping against the glass. As I settled into my seat, I noticed her. She walked in not long after I had arrived, slipping through the door like she had been a part of the place all along. She had an aura of calm about her, as though she was a regular here, someone who belonged. Her hair was dark and pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore a soft cream-colored sweater that seemed to blend effortlessly into the warm ambience of the restaurant. Her steps were quiet, measured, like she knew exactly where she was going. I watched as she made her way to the bar, her movements graceful, her expression peaceful. She took a seat, and for a moment, I thought I saw her glance in my direction. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I gave her a small smile, not wanting to intrude. But she didn't smile back, her gaze slipping away almost immediately. It was odd, but it wasn't something that felt all that strange, just a fleeting moment. I turned my attention back to the menu, deciding on what to order, but my curiosity about her lingered. There was something about the way she moved, something about the quiet confidence in her presence that made me watch her a little longer. After a while, I realized I had stopped reading the menu altogether. distracted by the strange sensation that seemed to crawl over me. I glanced up, my eyes following her again. She was gone. I blinked, trying to process the sudden shift. She had been sitting at the bar, not 5 minutes ago, but now there was an empty stool in front of the counter. The barista was still there, wiping down the counter, and a few other patrons were scattered around, but the woman was nowhere in sight. I looked around, expecting to see her heading toward the restroom or perhaps out the door, but there was no sign of her. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself I had probably missed her leaving, or maybe she had slipped out quietly without drawing attention. It wasn't uncommon for people to come and go in a place like this, especially on a quiet night. But something about it bothered me, a gnawing feeling at the back of my mind that told me this wasn't quite normal. I finished my meal in silence, pushing my thoughts aside. But as I paid for my food and stood to leave, I couldn't help but glance back toward the bar, just in case. And there it was. The stool where she had sat, still empty, the space around it unchanged, like she had never been there at all. The same calm atmosphere surrounded the place, the quiet chatter and soft music. But it felt off, like something had been shifted, moved in the most subtle of ways, just enough to make me question what I had seen. As I walked toward the door, I stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze rushing to meet me. The street outside was still quiet, and I could hear the faint echoes of laughter from within the restaurant behind me. I turned the corner, my footsteps light on the pavement, but the feeling that something had slipped just beyond my understanding stayed with me. The next day, I went back, feeling a strange compulsion to do so. The rain had stopped, and the streets were quiet again, like they had been the night before. I walked into the restaurant, expecting to see the same welcoming ambience, the same warmth, but when I stepped inside, everything felt different. The place was almost empty, a few people seated here and there, but the atmosphere seemed colder, less inviting. The lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the tables. I asked the waitress about the woman I had seen the previous evening, the one who had been sitting at the bar. She looked at me with a confused expression, and then said, "I'm not sure who you mean, sir. There's no one who fits that description who usually comes here." I paused, the words hanging in the air between us. My mind raced. I had to be mistaken, right? Maybe it wasn't the same place after all. But no, the layout was exactly as I remembered. The same worn chairs, the same crooked picture on the wall. And yet, something felt different. I paid for my coffee, my unease growing with every passing moment. The strange encounter weighed heavily on me as I left the restaurant, glancing over my shoulder one last time. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but I could have sworn, for just a second, I heard a faint sound, a door opening behind me. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. The feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't meant to be there, gnawed at me like an unspoken truth. I still don't understand what happened that night. I don't know if it was a trick of the light, or if I had imagined the whole thing. But every time I walk past that restaurant now, I wonder about the woman. I wonder if she ever really existed, or if I simply stepped into some version of reality that I wasn't supposed to see. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the softest whisper in the air, like a voice calling me back to that empty restaurant. But I can't go back. Not anymore. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air feels crisp, and the soft murmur of the world around you is just enough to make the silence comfortable. I had been walking down the same road, heading to a small cafe where I often went after work. The route was familiar, the street lined with trees that had started to shed their leaves, a hint of fall in the air. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 15 minutes. But that evening, it felt different. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense that something was just slightly off. It was as though the world around me had shifted just out of sight, and I was the only one who could feel it. I reached the first street sign, the one that marked the turn to the cafe. I'd passed it hundreds of times before, without ever thinking much about it. But that evening, something caught my eye. The sign, just an ordinary street sign, seemed wrong. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but the letters looked strange, slightly crooked, as though they were being pulled in different directions. I stopped for a moment, staring at it. I shook my head and laughed to myself, brushing off the odd sensation. It was probably just the lighting, I thought. The fading sunset casting weird shadows on the metal. But then I kept walking, only to glance back over my shoulder as I continued down the street. The sign had changed. The letters were different, more distorted than before, as though they had rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. It wasn't much, just a subtle difference. The street name, which had been familiar to me, no longer seemed right, but I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked a few more steps, my shoes clicking lightly against the sidewalk, and then I glanced back. The street sign had changed again. This time, it was even more pronounced. The name was almost unrecognizable, a jumble of letters that didn't make sense. The anxiety in my chest began to tighten, but I tried to convince myself that it was just the streetlights flickering in a strange pattern, or maybe my eyes were tired. I had been working late lately, after all. I kept walking, my pace a little quicker now. I wanted to reach the cafe and forget about it. But as I passed another block, I found myself glancing back again, almost without thinking. The sign had changed again. This time, the letters were completely jumbled, as if someone had taken the sign and tossed it into a blender. I stopped in my tracks. My heart began to beat faster. Something about this wasn't right. The sign this street I had walked down for years was different. I turned and walked back the way I came, hoping to find some kind of explanation, some sense of familiarity to ground me. But as I approached the sign again, my stomach churned. The sign had shifted again. Now it was entirely blank, as though someone had wiped the name of the street off it entirely. The metal was still there, the pole holding it up, but the sign itself was empty, a void in the place where something should have been. I stepped closer, my feet moving slowly, unwilling to believe what I was seeing. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing the cool metal, feeling the slight tremor in my hands. The street had completely changed now. Nothing about it looked familiar. It was like I had stepped into a parallel version of the neighborhood, one that didn't belong to me. The houses were different now, too older, their paint peeling, their windows dark and empty. The trees that had lined the road were gone, replaced by strange, gnarled shapes that seemed to twist unnaturally in the dim light. I turned around again, and suddenly, the cafe I had been walking to wasn't there anymore. It wasn't just hidden behind a building or obscured by the trees. It had vanished as though it had never existed. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath me was shifting, and I stumbled forward, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Panic clawed at my chest. I couldn't understand what was happening. I kept looking at the sign, trying to make sense of it, but it kept changing, flickering in and out of existence like some kind of illusion. I started walking again, faster now, desperate to find something familiar, something that could explain what was happening. The street should have been the same, but it wasn't. I turned a corner, hoping to escape the disorienting sensation that had taken hold of me, and found myself face to face with the same street sign again. I stopped in front of it, my heart thudding in my chest. The sign was different, again this time it was almost entirely unrecognizable, just a blur of distorted letters. It wasn't even a street name anymore. It was a mess of shapes and symbols that made no sense. I felt the panic rising again, overwhelming me. I stepped back, turned around, and started walking in the opposite direction, my mind racing. The street was still wrong, the houses around me all unfamiliar. I walked for what felt like hours, only to end up back in the same place, standing in front of the same sign. Each time I looked at it, it was different, a twisted version of itself, as though reality was slipping away with every glance. The sky had darkened now, and the rain began to fall in soft, steady sheets, but the sound of it wasn't calming. It only added to the sense of distortion that hung in the air. The world around me felt off-kilter, like I was walking through a dream where nothing made sense. I had no idea how long I had been standing there, caught in this loop, trying to make sense of the changes. Finally, with trembling hands, I pulled out my phone, hoping to see something, anything that would tell me what was happening. But when I looked at the screen, the map app was open, showing my location, right where I was standing. And yet, there was no street, no name. The map was blank. It was then that I realized I had stopped walking. I was no longer in the neighborhood I knew. I wasn't anywhere at all. I was standing in front of the same sign, but it no longer felt like a street I had ever walked down. It was just a sign, and the world around it had changed. I don't know how I got back home. I don't remember the details of how the night ended, but when I finally opened my door, the first thing I did was look out the window. The street outside was quiet again, familiar. The sign was back to normal, but I still can't forget the way it changed every time I looked at it. And every time I walk past that sign now, I wonder if it's really the same one I used to know, or if it's something else entirely. Something that shifts and bends when I'm not paying attention. It started out like any other drive. I had been on the road for hours, winding my way through the quiet, rural countryside. The air outside was crisp, and the sky stretched out in a muted gray, threatening rain, but it hadn't yet fallen. I had taken this route many times before, a long stretch of road that connected the smaller towns outside the city. It was peaceful to peaceful sometimes, with only the occasional farmhouse or truck passing by. But it was familiar, and in its own way, I found comfort in that. The drive had been uneventful until I hit the point where I was sure the road should have ended. I had been driving for what felt like longer than usual. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road, and I had planned on reaching the next town by dusk. But there was something about the landscape that felt strange, like I was moving through it faster than I should, or perhaps the road itself was changing. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 6:47 p.m. I had set out at 4:30. That was odd. I was sure the time didn't match the distance I'd covered. I didn't dwell on it at first. It was a long stretch of road, after all. Maybe it had been longer than I remembered. The trees along the side of the road were dense, and the only signs of life were the occasional barn or faded roadside marker. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of my tires on the asphalt and the hum of the engine. Then it happened. I passed the same farmhouse again. I froze for a moment, staring out the windshield. I knew I had seen that house before just a few minutes ago, right after the last bend. But now, here it was again, standing in the same spot, the lights flickering in the windows as if it hadn't moved at all. The farmhouse looked exactly the same, its peeling paint, the crooked picket fence, the red barn to the side. Even the way the light hit it was the same. I could almost feel my pulse quicken as the realization set in. I must have turned around without realizing it, right? I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. That's the only explanation. I looked at the road behind me, but there were no other cars. No sign that I had made a mistake. I shook my head. I had driven this route hundreds of times, I knew it. So why was I back here? The road ahead didn't seem any different. I kept driving, telling myself I was just tired, maybe losing my mind a little. I glanced at the clock, again 6:53 now. Wasn't that strange? How had I lost 10 minutes without even realizing it? I kept going, trying to ignore the creeping unease settling in my chest. But then the road began to change in ways that made me doubt my own senses. It became longer, stretching farther ahead, longer than I remembered. There were no signs now, no markers, no exits. Just endless asphalt, flanked by dark woods. The trees grew denser as the miles dragged on, their shadows swallowing the edges of the road, blotting out the dim light of the setting sun. I checked the gas gauge half full, but still, I wasn't sure I should keep going. I had expected to find the town by now, but there was nothing. No lights in the distance, no signs of civilization. Just the dark road, stretching on and on and on. I drove for another 10 minutes, 20, maybe 30. The road felt like it was consuming time itself. Then, I saw the farmhouse again. It wasn't possible. It was the same one. Same crooked fence, same barn, same flickering lights. But this time, the feeling of unease was replaced with something darker, a primal fear that I couldn't explain. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, I thought my fingers might break. I looked out at the farmhouse. It was just there, watching me. It was impossible. I knew it was impossible. I couldn't have gone in a circle. The road didn't loop back, couldn't. This stretch of highway had no loops, no turns that would bring me back here. Yet, there it was. The farmhouse, as if mocking me. I turned the car around, desperate now to find an answer. The road behind me felt just as endless as the one ahead. The trees grew darker, their shadows creeping further into the road, stretching long fingers that seemed to reach for me, trying to pull me back. The clock on my dashboard read 6:47 again. I checked it. I stared at it. 6:47. No, that couldn't be right. The minutes were slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but the road never seemed to end. The farmhouse vanished from sight behind me, but I couldn't shake the sense that it was still there, watching. I drove faster, more urgently, but there was no change, no end to the road. The trees began to blur into the darkness, and I felt a cold sweat creep up the back of my neck. The air in the car felt thick, oppressive, and my breath started coming in shallow bursts. I tried to call someone, my friend, anyone, but there was no signal. I checked the GPS. There was no signal there either. No maps, no roads. Just the empty void of the endless road. I don't know how long I drove after that. It felt like hours, but there was no way to tell. The clock stayed stuck at 6:47, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the road had no end, that I was trapped, moving forward but never getting anywhere. Eventually, I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking now, my mind clouded with a deep sense of dread. I sat in the car, staring out into the darkness, not sure if I should keep driving or if I had already been driving for too long. I was afraid that if I turned around again, I would see the farmhouse again. I was afraid that if I drove forward, I would never see anything but this road, stretching endlessly into the night. I still don't know how I got back. Somehow, without explanation, I found myself driving back down a familiar stretch of Highway 1. I recognized my car still humming softly as the sun began to rise. But even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that the road kept going, that it had no end, and that I had only left because the road allowed it. I'll never know for sure. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over everything. I had spent the day running errands, feeling the weight of the usual routine settle into my shoulders. The air was warm, but a cool breeze kept the temperature comfortable as I walked back home through the neighborhood. I didn't expect anything unusual that day. Life had been pretty normal lately, the same as always. My mind was occupied with thoughts of the mundane work, a dinner I had to prepare, the book I was halfway through. As I turned the corner onto my street, I saw her standing there, just outside the small cafe that I passed every day. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She wore a simple black dress that seemed to catch the light in a way that made her stand out against the dull backdrop of the street. I didn't know her. Not really, but there was something about her that made me pause. Her face wasn't unfamiliar, though I couldn't place where I had seen her before. I kept walking, not wanting to seem too obvious about staring, but my feet seemed to slow down without my permission, drawn toward her. She was staring straight ahead, and as I passed, Her eyes turned toward me. Our gazes met, and I felt an odd shiver run down my spine. Her eyes were dark, almost too dark, like there was something lurking in them that I couldn't understand. It was a look that made me feel seen to seen. She didn't smile or wave. She just looked at me, and something about it made me stop. I was so caught up in the moment that I forgot to keep walking. The world around me seemed to fade into a blur, the sounds of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the trees disappearing as I focused entirely on her. And then it happened. In the midst of that quiet, strange moment, I noticed something unsettling. Her shadow. It was cast behind me. I don't know how I missed it at first, but when I looked down, I saw her shadow stretching out on the pavement behind me, just like mine. But it wasn't quite right. It wasn't the shadow of someone standing in front of the sunlight. It was darker, sharper, like it was being cast from a source I couldn't see. The way it elongated unnerved me. I looked back at her, but she was still standing perfectly still, her eyes locked on mine. The shadow behind me seemed to stretch further, closer to me, and I felt my heart race, a cold chill settling into my chest. I couldn't bring myself to look away, even though every instinct told me I should. It was like the shadow had a life of its own, moving and bending in ways that felt wrong. I should have walked away, should have kept moving, but I couldn't. I felt rooted to the spot, my feet glued to the ground, my body trembling. Her gaze never wavered, and as I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, I realized I could no longer hear the usual sounds of the street. The soft hum of the city, the rustling of the trees, the occasional distant car. All of it was gone. Everything was still, except for her eyes, watching me. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, she turned. Her head tilted slightly, as if something had caught her attention. She glanced away, her gaze breaking from mine for the first time. That was when the shadow shifted. It stretched further, and it moved. It was as though the shadow no longer belonged to her, or to me, but to something else entirely. I could feel it's something cold, something foreign, inching toward me from behind. I turned quickly, my head snapping in the direction of the shadow, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty streets stretching out behind me. I felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath me wasn't quite solid. The air felt heavier, thick with an unexplainable presence. I turned back toward her, but she was gone. She had disappeared, fading into the quiet streets without a trace. The cafe was empty, the door still ajar, but there was no sign of her. The moment I'd shared with her had vanished, just like the shadow that had moved when I wasn't looking. My pulse raced as I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I glanced down again at the shadow, but now it was just my own, stretching out in front of me, as if nothing had ever been there. I turned and hurried home, my footsteps quick and uneven, my mind racing with confusion and dread. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. How could I? Who would believe that someone's shadow had moved on its own? That I had seen something that wasn't there, and then watched as it disappeared into thin air. But every time I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of her gaze. And when I walk past that cafe, I still look over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there again. And sometimes, Just sometimes, I feel like the shadow behind me is watching. Not just mine, but hers too, waiting. It was a quiet evening, the kind of night where the rain falls steadily but without much intensity. Just a soft patter that blends into the background. I had just finished dinner, feeling a bit restless, and decided to go for a walk. The streets were wet and empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk, their dull yellow glow reflecting in the puddles. The air was thick with the smell of rain and earth, the cool breeze feeling refreshing on my skin. I live in a fairly quiet neighborhood, one of those places where everyone knows each other's names, and the streets feel familiar, safe, even. But that night, there was something about the silence that felt a bit too still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered, like a cloud hanging just above me. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and continued walking, my footsteps quiet on the damp pavement. As I walked down the street, I noticed a car coming up ahead. It wasn't unusual to see a car this time of night, but this one caught my attention for some reason. It was moving slowly, almost deliberately, as though the driver was taking their time. The car wasn't anything special, just a nondescript sedan, the kind you'd see on any street. The headlights pierced through the mist of the rain, casting a soft glow that reflected off the wet pavement. There was something oddly comforting about the presence of the car, like a reminder that the world outside was still turning, still moving. But then, as I continued walking, I realized something strange. The car wasn't moving away from me, like most cars do. It was matching my pace. I hadn't consciously adjusted my speed, but somehow, the car was just there, keeping a few yards ahead of me. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but the feeling of being watched began to creep up my spine. I glanced to the side, but the car's headlights were now just enough to illuminate my path, the vehicle remaining a constant presence just ahead of me. I quickened my pace slightly, just to see if it would pass me. The car did the same. It was as if it were following me, matching my every step. At that point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept walking, my steps now hurried, but every time I glanced ahead, the car was still there. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that it could be nothing more than the driver being in the same direction. But then something unsettling happened. The car turned onto a side street, a road that veered off to the right. I froze for a moment, confused. The road that the car turned onto wasn't a main street, it was just a small side street, lined with old houses and fading streetlights. It didn't lead anywhere important, just a narrow curve around the block. I had walked that street many times before, and yet, something about the car turning there didn't sit right with me. I didn't mean to, but I found myself following. It wasn't a conscious decision. My feet just seemed to move on their own. I crossed the intersection, the streetlights flickering overhead, and began walking down the side street. It felt like I was being pulled, like I had no choice but to follow the car, even though every part of my body screamed at me to turn around, to walk away. But the car was still ahead of me, its taillights glowing softly in the distance, like a beacon leading me further down a path I didn't understand. The rain continued to fall, softly at first, then harder, the rhythmic patter against the pavement almost hypnotic. The quiet, empty houses lined the street, their windows dark, as if they were watching me. There was an eerie stillness in the air. Even the trees lining the sidewalk seemed to stand motionless, their branches barely swaying in the wind. It was like the whole world had gone still, holding its breath. I kept walking, my footsteps now the only sound that broke the silence. And the car remained ahead of me, just a few yards in front. I felt the strange compulsion to keep going, and yet, something inside me urged me to stop. But I didn't. I couldn't. The car turned onto another street, and without thinking, I followed again, my legs moving of their own accord. It was as if I were being drawn into something I couldn't escape. As I followed, the streetlights grew more distant, the shadows longer. The houses seemed older, more dilapidated. I didn't remember this part of the neighborhood, but I couldn't bring myself to stop and look. I was too focused on the car, too focused on the way it moved just ahead of me. The further I went, the less familiar the surroundings became. The streets weren't the ones I knew, the ones I'd walked countless times. This was somewhere different, somewhere darker. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car vanished. I had been so focused on the taillights, so consumed by the strange, overwhelming need to follow it, that I didn't notice the street ahead. The road that should have continued had disappeared. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. The car had made the turn, just as it had before, but this time, there was nothing, no car, no lights. The street ahead of me was empty, the road vanishing into the same void that had enveloped the rest of the neighborhood. I looked around, but I was completely alone. My heart began to race. I turned around, expecting to see the familiar streets of my neighborhood behind me, but all I saw was darkness. The streetlights were out now, and the houses were no longer the ones I knew. The quiet had deepened, suffocating, and everything felt wrong. I was standing in the middle of a street that shouldn't have existed, in a part of the neighborhood that had never been here. I didn't know where I was anymore, and the feeling of being watched, of being pulled deeper, grew stronger. I walked back, slowly at first, then faster, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The rain fell harder now, a constant, steady drum of water against the pavement. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't find my way out. The neighborhood seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the streets twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. I stopped and looked around, hoping for some sign, some way to orient myself, but there was nothing. No sign of life. No cars, no sounds. Just the empty streets stretching out in every direction, endless and silent. The last thing I remember is standing in the middle of the street, trying to understand how I had gotten there, how I had followed the car without thinking. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a nightmare brought on by the rain or stress or something else. But when I looked outside, the street was still wet, the rain still falling. And in the distance, just a few houses down, a car was parked on the curb. The same sedan, the same unmarked vehicle I had seen the night before. But this time, it wasn't moving. It was just there, waiting.